Beautiful. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. I wanted to introduce our guests. I think this is a really important conversation because, between the pandemic and the election this past year, we have been relying on news sources, I think more than ever, at least in my case, but it's not always that easy to determine what's credible with all this influx of information. And that's especially true when it comes to health coverage. So I am so thrilled to welcome our two guests here today. We have Sally Lehrman, who is the founder and CEO, right, of the Trust Project. And then Lorie Hearn, who is the founder, CEO, editor, and every other title at inewsource in San Diego, California. So with that, I will kick it over to Sally to give a quick presentation. I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll be doing a Q&A after the presentation. So don't hesitate to leave some comments or questions, and we'll be monitoring the chat as we go along. So with that, thanks so much for being here. And Sally, if you want to get started.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Celeste and Christy, for inviting us to come speak with this group. And I'm really interested in speaking with all of you, hearing your questions, listening to your thoughts. I also want to thank Lorie, who's a part of the Trust Project and agreed to come speak today. I think she's got a super interesting story and site that you ought to know about. So as Celeste said, I founded the Trust Project, and what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. And then, but before that, or maybe first I'll tell you that, and then I want to show you a little bit about the landscape of trust in the news now and some of the things that we're contending with, all of us. I mean, it's not just something that news is struggling with, but I think all of the whole public is sharing with this. And then I'll tell you about our trust indicators, which are something that we design collaboratively with the news organizations and the public to try to help people differentiate between news that is designed, with quality and integrity behind it and operates that way, and other kinds of information. So let me bear with me. I'm going to start some slides for you. So I'm going to start up my slide deck. Move that up and play from the start. Okay. Yeah, and you can contact me. This is our Twitter information. I can also, I'm happy to share email if you wanted to follow up in some way. So as I mentioned, I started the Trust Project about in 2014. And at that time, you may recall that we were in a period where trust in news was already declining and had been declining. And as a result of that decline now, I would say that's why that created this opening for misinformation and disinformation to really come in and flood us. And what was happening back then is we were really seeing the effects of news transitioning over to the digital environment. So in that environment, everything pretty much looks the same. News looks the same as sales copy, looks the same as propaganda designed to make you angry or even incite you to violence. And so news organizations in these intervening years up to 2014, from about 1998 to 2014, had unfortunately kind of looked to the lowest common denominator. We're looking at clickbait, trying to figure out, well, should we put more of a voice or opinion in our stories? And as a result, trust was getting even worse. So I thought, why can't we flip the picture? Like, why are we letting technology ruin journalism, so to speak? So I talked to some people in technology, and they said, well, yes, you can do that. You have to train the algorithms. And I didn't know, I thought that would be pretty straightforward. I didn't have any idea how hard that would be. But the idea now of the Trust Project is, could we reclaim the traditional role of news and journalism, and that is provide, if you imagine the public kind of adrift on the sea of information, provide this guidance, in effect be a lighthouse to guide the public to information that's trustworthy, and also provide machine readable signals that the technology platforms could use to surface, to shepherd people to news with integrity behind it. So that's That was the concept. And you'll see how that's developed over the years and how we actually made that happen. Now, where are we right now with trust? I thought it would be helpful to kind of ground us in the situation now. Now, this is from a couple of surveys that were done in spring 2020. And at that time, news organizations have been putting a lot of effort into trying to be more transparent and use different methods to build trust. And in spring, it looked like it was really working. And if you think about spring, that was right after maybe a month into the pandemic. And trust in traditional media here was up 7%. And Nick Newman says at Reuters Institute, journalism matters and is in demand again. Then in October, it reaches its lowest point ever, the record lows. So now we're down 8%. So what's happening in October, late October, early November, exactly when this study was done? Well, the US election. And also people getting kind of pandemic exhaustion, I would say. And at this point, people were saying, 59% of people were saying most news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or political position than informing the public. And even you may feel a little bit that way. And there you have some good reasons, because here's a story from the New York Times showing that, in fact, 1,300 new local sites had come into play just in one set of organizations that just published coverage that was paid for by corporate PR firms and Republican groups. Now I'm not showing you Republican just because that's the only place it's coming from. We could also show a map of liberal paid sites, although honestly there are fewer of them in the United States. So here we are in a situation where it is very difficult because there are a lot of imposters moving into this space where journalism used to be dominant. So in trying to understand the field a little bit more, I just realized I didn't turn on my timer. Christy and Celeste, maybe let me know when I'm going on too long. So we did a study with Ipsos, which is an international research firm, the Trust Project Ipsos, and to ask a little bit more about how people value news, why they use it, and when they're willing to pay for it. And what we found, the really good news was 82% of people globally make an effort to seek out trustworthy news. So to me, that's just so encouraging because people really care. It matters. And this has been consistent and across all of our research. And then 58% said they themselves, they thought could spot false information. 30%, only 30% thought others could. So we think that perhaps people are a little overconfident. In fact, everybody could use a little bit more help spotting false information. And that's where the trust indicators come into play. So when we first started trying to develop these trust indicators, I thought, well, we really can't just keep talking among ourselves. We need to go out and talk to the public. And I really like this user-centered design idea where you go in and you talk with people, you do these in-depth interviews, and then you keep iterating your design. And so we went out and talked to people across the US, Europe, and I think mainly those two areas, and talk to them about what they value in the news, why they trust it, and why don't they. And we across race, class, gender, generation, geography, we used all those dimensions in bringing just together a group of people to interview. And we found across US and Europe very similar groups of people. And so I'm going to tell you about those 4 groups because maybe you'll identify with some of them. So first, or know people like that. So first was the avid news user. Now this was about 5 years ago we did this research. So the avid news, this is Alex. She lives in Detroit. She has her own company that produces poster board. And she says, I do not understand why people do not read the news. You might as well put your finger in a light socket. It's like that dangerous. And so she's out there like other avid news users, checking and cross-checking the news and sending it out to others and curating it. And then we have Alma here, who was assistant to the president of the Detroit Public Library. And she says, I want news that's nutritionally fit. Every time I read an article, I have more questions, and that's good. And she's engaged. We call her engaged, like others like her, because she says she grew up reading the Detroit Free Press on her daddy's knee. She continues to subscribe. She reads the news. She talks about it with her friends, but she's not quite out there like Alex doing all the promotion of news. She also felt underserved, like she wasn't quite getting enough about her own community, whether it be the Black community or Detroit, in the news. Now here's Wendy, who we call the opportunistic user. She lives in Arizona, actually, and went with her in-laws, or because while her husband's out of a job, she has a couple children. She doesn't have time to get out there and seek out the news, or didn't at the time. And so news was just there for her when it washed over her. So when she was at work in the break room or got a notification on her phone, then she'd look at news. But she still felt that it was valuable. News is there to tell us what's going on, as she put it, around the world, around the neighborhood, to help make us better, she said. And so she saw the value. She also felt underserved. There's a photo of her looking at her phone because she had to subscribe to some specific sites in order to get news about her community, Latinos in her area. And then we had the angry disengaged. So, and again, even though I'm showing someone call it about the Clinton News Network, we could see this across the political, mostly on the two political extremes. I would trust a system that was as critical of institutions as I am. So thinking that news really isn't critical and maybe is in the pocket of institutions. So across those four types, what was interesting, very different ways of engaging with the news, they all had similar ways. We could bring together similar ways that they assessed the news to decide, is it trustworthy? And I'll walk you through those. And this is US and Europe. So first of all, people said, we understand that journalists aim to be impartial, but nobody is. So tell us what your agenda is. We want to know your agenda, because otherwise they're just going to assume one. Diverse perspectives. Again, US and Europe, people said, we're just hearing mainly from people at high levels of business and government. We want to see people like ourselves in the news. And we even want to see people not like ourselves so that we can understand them better. The journalist. Who is this journalist? More information about their background, their expertise. People wanted to feel more of a connection to journalists in order to trust them. What am I looking at? So people felt, and you may feel this way too, where that news and opinion was blending. And people didn't like that. The ones that we interviewed, they didn't like that. They said it was hard to tell the difference, and it also made it hard to trust the news organizations. How do you know what you know, journalists? So we're an expectation of more information about where the journalists got their information, how they went about reporting it. Was it locally sourced? So do you know me? Do you know my community? Were you here when you reported this? Or were you sitting at your desk in New York? And let me participate. So an expectation, increasing expectation of engagement of the news organization really listening to them and to be responsive. And if we were all in the room together, I would ask you how well these resonate with you. I don't know if it will work that well with this big of a room, but I hope maybe you'll say in chat. So what do we do? Well, we learned all these things from talking to the public, and some of them were eye-openers to editors, some of them were not. And so we brought together news executives, again, through Europe and US and Canada, Latin America, and said, here's what we're learning from the public. How do we merge these or integrate these with journalistic standards, which what we know is news with integrity, and then try to create this set of trust indicators that can help people make decisions about whether to trust a particular news site. So here's what we came up with. And the idea is for you and for others to be able to see right on a news site these, or answer those questions, answer those areas of questions, and make your own decisions. So not to tell you trust this or don't trust this, but enable you, give you the information to decide on your own. Because that's kind of a fundamental principle of journalism, is that we don't tell you what to do, we offer you the information to make your own decisions. So first was getting to the agenda. Well, what are the rules that you follow as an organization? What's your mission? Do you have an ethics policy? What do you do to ensure that you're accurate? Who owns this organization? How is it funded? And how does that affect or not affect the journalism itself? Journalist information. So topic and demographic expertise. Does this journalist understand my community? How long have they reported on this topic? Let's say, what other topics have they reported on? And the idea is, if we show you these trust indicators on pages, then not only do you have this information to make a good decision, but the news organization kind of has to actually put the work behind it to support these promises and these indications. Label news analysis and opinion. So that's that idea that news and opinion were blending. So helping the public understand what the purpose is. Is it news? Is it opinion? Is it paid content? Citations and references. What's the source? So where do our news sites that are all part of the Trust Project now are showing on investigative stories or controversial stories more information about where that news came from and who their sources were. It's already in the story. Usually, typically, a good news organization would already put that in there, but now there's additional information. Same with methods. So why is this a priority for this news organization? What was the process they used? And this, again, is something that primarily for investigative stories that might be controversial, where the public may really want to know more about, again, that agenda behind it, which the journalism agenda is to serve the public and to help the public understand what's going on in the community and help make decisions about your own lives, your community, and your government. So locally sourced, did it use local knowledge, the story? Which the journalists have local knowledge? Were they there to report the story? Diverse voices, both social, demographic, and also ideological, and also in the staffing. So all of our sites, and Lorie may show you this, disclose their staff diversity. And finally, what kind of commitment does this news organization have to public listening and accountability? So those are the 8 trust indicators. And actually, let me see what time. I'm going to skip over this. I was going to tell you briefly, I'll say briefly, what we've found since we created those trust indicators and started putting them on the pages. And now, the world has changed a bit. Everybody across our different groups, user groups, have become more engaged. So taking avid to taking action, engaged to more like the old avid, more the old opportunistic, more like the informed engaged, and the angry, unfortunately, engaged now with untrustworthy news. So, and I am gonna skip over this. We can come back to it. But this is what the trust indicators look like on news sites. So what all of our news organizations do is present those eight trust indicators, so sets of information to help you understand where this news is coming from on their pages. So the Washington Post here is showing its agenda through its best practices policies, its agenda to serve the public, but they offer like the ownership structure and how they go about decide on sources or not naming sources. Frontline, showing the journalist, information about the journalist. This is a small Highlands Current small paper up in upstate New York, showing you that it's an investigative story, how they went about sourcing it, and who the editor is, and showing you that they're part of the Trust Project, that little T. But the important thing about these trust indicators is not only are all these sites around the world showing them, this is where all through these different countries and places we're seeing, can see trust indicators now, and we just recently added Belgium. But not only are they in these spaces, but you can use that set of 8 to assess any kind of news organization. So these organizations are making it easy for you And as a result, I think, honestly, many would say that many have said that their standards are increasing, their efforts to really support those standards are increasing, but they're available to anyone, to be able to, anyone in the public to be able to use, to think critically about the news you're looking at. So I'm going to stop now and hand it over to Lorie, who's going to tell you more about how they are implementing the trust indicators, or have done so, because they are a member of the Trust Project. So let me stop share.
I think one thing I'd just like to add there, Sally, is I was fortunate to be asked to screen some of the applicants for the Trust Project's next phase.
Yeah.
And I found it to be a really interesting process, because one thing you should know about the organizations that participate in the Trust Project is they have shown a real commitment to these indicators. It's not just giving the right answers to try to get the Trust Project. I mean, much of it is really showing your commitment to the policies that you're talking about. So these organizations have gone a couple levels up. It's not an easy process to be accepted into the Trust Project. So these organizations really are worth knowing about. So, like I've been introduced, I'm the CEO and the editor of inewsource. We are a nonprofit investigative news organization based in San Diego. I'll take a couple seconds and talk about nonprofit news. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the difference between kind of traditional legacy media and nonprofit news, but nonprofit news is a fairly new phenomenon. That is 10 or 12 years ago. When I founded inewsource, there were very few nonprofit news organizations in the country. There were literally enough of us to sit around a table in New York and talk about this new phenomenon called nonprofit news. And today there are some 300 nonprofit news organizations in the US, part of something called the Institute for Nonprofit News, which is the membership organization that we belong to. inewsource is one of the founding members of INN. And nonprofit, basically the difference between nonprofit and for-profit news is we are an IRS code. We are a 501c3. I'm sure most of you know. You have organizations that you support that support the homeless, or schools, churches, other social enterprises that allow you basically to accept donations from people, and in return, those folks get to take a tax deduction for the donation. So because legacy media was failing so miserably, many of us decided we would start news organizations on a nonprofit model and see if we could gather support from readers out there. So I have been a lifelong journalist, and I say that seriously. I knew I wanted to be a reporter when I was 12 years old, putting out my Girl Scout newsletter. I like to know things before everybody else and then tell them about it. That was kind of my initial motivation as a child. But as I got into high school and college, I started to see the more serious nature of journalism. Worked on my college paper. I was a college student during the Vietnam War, when many of my colleagues, my student colleagues, were going off to the war. So it was very personal for us. And I really did begin to understand the importance of holding powerful institutions to account for what they were telling the public and what they were not telling the public. So that has been my passion in my professional life. I've worked for 5 newspapers over the course of my career. The longest place I had stayed was the Union Tribune in San Diego. I was a reporter there, then I was an assistant editor, then I became the Metro editor, which means I was overseeing all of the local coverage for the county of 3 million people. Then I became a senior editor for investigations in Metro, which was probably the best job, short of being a reporter, that I thought I ever could have. I had a 4-person investigative team reporting directly to me, and we were doing some really serious government accountability work I was very proud of. The newspaper won the Pulitzer in 2006 for its and our Washington bureau leading the investigation of a congressman called Randy Duke Cunningham, who ultimately went to prison. The stories that our paper and the Washington bureau broke basically showed how he was taking bribes from a defense contractor. He just recently got out of prison. So I was really proud of the work we were doing. But when I became a senior editor at the Union Tribune, we were sold. We were a family operation for 100 years, and the newspaper was sold in 2008 to a private equity company. And many of you may know about private equity companies. They basically buy distressed businesses and do things that they hope will turn the company around and then sell them for a profit. The code here is that meant laying people off. And so my job as a journalist very quickly turned out to be more about human resources and figuring out who to lay off in the newsroom next. And I thought, you know, I need to, this is not my career path. And so I joined a few friends around the country in investigative journalism who were experimenting with nonprofit news. And I essentially took this giant leap of faith in myself and my community and left the newspaper and started inewsource as a nonprofit investigative journalism organization. And being a journalist, I've told you about my passions. Actually, when I started inewsource, I didn't really know what I was getting into. That is running a business. And very quickly in year 2, we almost went out of business for lack of money. I didn't realize what the fundraising was going to be like. But I didn't give up. I thought, okay, we can do this. I didn't take a paycheck for 8 months, and I had to lay off one of my reporters. But little by little, we started getting donations. We got some grant money because people were interested in this regional nonprofit news model. And today we have a budget of $2.2 million. I have 6.5 journalists. That counts a part-time journalist, a full-time photographer. And we have very ambitious growth plans. We actually plan to be 30 people in the next 2 years. Much of that is thanks to a very large investment we received in 2019 from the American Journalism Project, which is a foundation that is funding nonprofit news organizations, civic news organizations, as they call us. They're funding our revenue side. They're funding innovation to help sustain credible journalism. So we were fortunate enough to be in the first cohort of grantees. And like I said, we have very ambitious plans to grow both our business side and our journalism side. So we wanted to become part of the Trust Project because I believe so strongly in fighting the misconceptions and some of the truths about what's going on out there in the journalism world. One of our core values at inewsource is transparency. And I thought, well, the Trust Project, getting the trust indicators embedded on our website and making a commitment to these indicators is the best way to start to show people that they can believe in our news. You know, when I talk to people, I often say, if a news organization tells you you can trust me, you often hear their branding. It says, we're the most trustworthy news organization in the area, or you can trust our news. And I sit back and I think, if you hear that from commercial media, public media, any media that you consume, I would implore you to ask them, why should I trust you? If the answer is, well, we've been around for 50 years, that's not good enough. Sally's just talked about how things have changed over the years. And unless you can give me some really good reasons for why I should trust what you are telling me, I'm going to be skeptical. So I think that if somebody asked me, why can you trust inewsource? I can give you a whole list of reasons, and I will begin to go over them right now. There are very tangible kinds of reasons, and let me share my screen so I can show you our website. Here you go. So this is our website, and you can see up here at the top, standards and policies. That is where we have the trust indicators embedded in our website. And if you look at this one story, for example, that we just filed yesterday, there you go. You'll see this right under the byline, why you can trust inewsource. And that takes you to our trust indicators. It's not fancy looking, but it does the job. We have our mission, our ethics policy, our commitment to diversity, our ownership structure, which is basically we're not owned by anyone. We're essentially owned by the people because we are a nonprofit organization. We have our financial, our audits, our 990s, everything right there on the website. If you want to look into us, you don't have to search Google or go, searching around on GuideStar. We have everything right on our website. Funding and grants. We believe in being totally transparent about who gives us money. Anyone who gives us money is listed on our website. Let's see if I can show you our list of donors. Our supporters from 50,000 plus, we list mainly foundations, right down to people who give us less than $999, down to $1. And we've certainly had people say, I've had messages from people on occasion saying, well, I see so-and-so supports you and that's why you did that story. Or that story is biased because so-and-so gives you money. And that's always going to happen. It certainly happens with traditional media who are reliant on advertising. When I worked for a newspaper, we certainly got pushback from people who would say, oh, because this particular advertiser advertises with you, you're not writing about this or you're writing about that. And you're always going to have to combat that. But we have other reasons as well. As we wanted to be the member of the Trust Project in the San Diego region. And there are a number of other commercial and nonprofit organizations in San Diego, but we're the only one that has the trust indicators that has been accepted into that program. So we feel that's a really important validation of our commitment to transparency. We also have a very rigorous fact-checking process. Fact-checking is addressed as a trust indicator, but we go above and beyond in terms of our fact-checking. Literally, the way we fact-check is a reporter finishes a story and it's edited, and then they sit down with either an editor or another reporter who's not familiar with the story, and that reporter literally has to defend every fact in the story. I mean, this process can sometimes take a week to get through a really long investigation, but I mean, literally, if you have someone's name in the story, John Smith, 36. Well, how do you know his name is John Smith? I literally want to see his driver's license. I want to hear him on an audio saying and spelling his name. How do you know he's 36? I mean, this is literally how we do our fact checking. So every fact in a story, the reporter who has reported and written the story must defend every single fact. So we can feel confident that we have backup material that will confirm every single fact in our stories. We do that for every story. We have yet another process, which we have called, we've coined the phrase, transparifying a story. And I'm happy to be able to tell you today that our transparify function is working again. We had basically built this tool, which enables us to do two versions of a story. I'll give you one small example here. It enables us to publish two versions of a story, one that just looks like a normal story with a few links, and another story, if you click a button, the story turns completely red, and every single fact in that story is hyperlinked to a document or a video clip or an audio clip or a spreadsheet, something that you, the reader, can look at and say, I can find out where this fact came from. So you don't have to take our word for it. You can fact check us, and you can look at our sources to see if you want to believe what we have been able to produce. So it kind of works like this. One of the reasons our transparify function has not worked for the last number of months is we got a new website late last year, and in migrating the website over to the new format, a number of things, tools and other things in our old website broke. So we're now in the process of going through and trying to fix them. But this is this is not the greatest example, but this is a little bit about how it works. We have a box that says check our sources or some other verbiage. And then if you hit this transparify button, suddenly links will appear in the story. So if you don't want to be bothered with links, you can turn that off and just read the story. But if you're really curious about all the facts in the story, usually every single line turns into a red link. This is just one of our sort of development examples that we're still working to get the bugs out of our new Transparify tool. But we're one of the only ones that I know of that uses a tool like this to this extent, to really say to people, you don't have to believe us. You could just go to our sources yourself. So those are the main ways that we really try to be transparent. Also, as part of the Trust Project, we take very seriously our sourcing. One of the things that really irritates me as a longtime journalist is the number of unnamed sources that particularly come out of Washington. But I think a lot of journalists have gotten kind of lazy about sourcing their stories, particularly giving reasons for why they allowed someone anonymity. I think people have to remember that the source asks for anonymity, but it's the news organization who agrees to it. So we need to be giving reasons to the public as to why we thought the reason the person wanted anonymity was good enough. I mean, one of the things that drives me crazy is when I see a story that says, John Smith, who asked that his name not be used, or John Smith, who prefers not to have his name used, or so-and-so who declined to give his name because he didn't have permission to speak to the media. I think these reasons are really bogus, and I think readers should push back on those. I think you need to be very specific. So-and-so who asked that his name not be used because he could lose his job, or so-and-so, asked that his name not be used because he feared for the safety of his family. I mean, these I think are very good and understandable reasons for a reader. But when you just sprinkle into a story unnamed sources, particularly those that you allow to say inflammatory things without attribution, I personally think it's an outrage. Sally and I have talked a little bit about the sourcing part of this in the Trust Project, because I think it's really important that be considered to a greater degree. I understand there are some countries where journalists are losing their lives, and many people could lose their life if they were allowing their name or the name of their family to be used, and they're really trying to convey important safety information. Those are the kinds of exceptions that I could absolutely see are necessary to get information to the public. But I think in the United States we've gotten a little bit lax about sourcing. The other thing I wanted to show you was we are very clear on, see if I can find that. We're very clear on our, oh, sorry, I'm getting all kinds of messages here. On methodologies, and I don't want to take too much more time because I want to hear your questions, but inewsource is a data-based organization. In our investigative journalism, we do what we can to find data that will back up our stories, or we take the lead from the data and see if there is a story in that data that's worth telling. One of the things that we do is we always write a methodology with a data-driven story. So it's a side story that will explain where we got the data, how we crunched it, if there was data that we took out of a data set, to clean it or whatever, so that would tell a reader that maybe you could look at that data and think it's slightly skewed because we've eliminated some of the fields. But we always explain to people exactly how we got the data that we used and how we manipulated it and how we analyzed it, so that you can, again, you as a reader can look behind our stories and say, well, I see how they analyzed that data and I think they were cheating, or I don't think that was really valid. You can draw your own conclusion, but I always feel very strongly that when you're doing, data doesn't lie. What do they say? I'll think of it in a second, but there's a saying about how, facts don't lie, but data doesn't lie, but people who use data can lie. So, so anyway, I believe very strongly in that level of transparency about data. And finally, the other thing in transparency is inewsource. Our mission is to serve the community with fact-based, data-driven accountability and investigative news in the San Diego region. And a second, but equally important goal for us is to teach and mentor future investigative journalists. So one of the things that we do as a team is we go out into the community and into classrooms and do seminars basically on how you, the public, can discern fact from fiction. So it's kind of taking the trust indicators a little bit further, but actually sitting down and saying, look, if you think this photograph has been doctored, here's a way you can find out if it really has. So on that, I think I'll close, and hopefully you'll have some great questions for us. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was very insightful. I would invite anyone who has questions to drop them in the chat. I have a few of my own, so I think I'd like to start with Sally, and here's just a basic one for you, Sally. You've created all these indicators using feedback from the public and from news organizations based on what we all think trustworthy means, right? I'm curious to hear, how do you know that these trust indicators work? Like, what kind of research has the Trust Project done so far to measure if they are actually improving trust?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that was on our minds, of course, after we had invented these trust indicators and news sites had started to use them, and they started using them just with the idea that these were logical and we didn't have the data. So we worked with an organization called the Center for Media Engagement at UT Austin and asked them to do an analysis of the trust indicators, and they did. They studied, they had 1,200 people, half saw the trust indicators on a page and half did not, and there was randomly split. And they found a statistically significant difference in trust in the news site when the trust indicators were present. Also, trust in the individual journalist, so that the news site told the whole story and was reliable, and that the journalist had basically done their homework. So that was one study. And then since then, we've done some others. One, we just went back this last summer, as I mentioned, talked to people about how they perceive the trust indicators. And what we found was that they have held up very well over the, since we started them, and with all the political and social changes. People wanted to see more in the way of actual action behind the diverse voices, so not just claims. They wanted to see more maybe merging of local and national news reporting. And also the other piece was, that's the slide I skipped over, there was a lot of worry that emotion within the news story was going to affect people's own perceptions of the news. So they were, there was a lot of feeling that they themselves brought a lot of emotion in their perceptions of the news and worries about being able to identify reliable news. And so that's where it kind of showed us again the power and importance of the trust indicators to help people navigate through what we're seeing right now.
I can just jump in and say that one of the struggles I think news organizations have is that people actually have gotten so used to kind of opinions or points of view, as they call it in news stories, that we've had people tell us that they think our news stories are boring because, I go through and do what I call defanging. If there's anything in a story that tends to show the reporter's bias or, is an opinion of any kind, we take that out. We reword things. We try to give people just the facts. And so I think some people have become used to they say, I just want to know what you want me to do, or I want to know what it is. And we're committed to just giving you the facts and empowering you to make that decision. But I think people have gotten used to hearing these points of view, and also they're busy. They read something and they want to know what the answer is, like, really fast. So
yeah, people are definitely searching for a shortcut, and I think especially if they rely on TV news, they're always bombarded with that. Lorie, so, you kind of touched on this, but I'm curious. Maybe I missed it. I'm not sure if you mentioned when you guys joined the Trust Project, and I'm curious, how your readership has reacted to it. Is this something that they've noticed and commented on? Are you being very, I mean, obviously transparency is in your mission. You know, when you were announcing things like this, what did they have to say?
You know, we didn't get a whole lot of feedback that I can personally recall. We did do kind of a branding little campaign about it, but it was kind of underscoring our transparency value, which we've always tried to promote as distinguishing us among other news organizations. So I can't remember specific feedback, but I just feel good being able to point people to it. There's much more information. The trust indicators, we had most of our policies already in place. The trust project made us rethink some of them and reword them and sort of recommit to some of the things that the trust project pointed out were really important to people. So, I mean, for example, if you click on a byline, it takes you now to something about the reporter. So right away, you can know something a little personal or know their professional qualifications. Some of those things are simple, but I think they mean something to the readers.
Absolutely. One thing I just noticed in the chat that I wanted to share, Kathleen, Lorie asked you, how do you determine the risk of biases in data? And then how do you communicate that to your audience?
Well, there's always a risk. I was just trying to think of that old adage, which I couldn't get out of my mouth a few minutes ago, but it did occur to me. It's figures don't lie, but liars figure. And that's something we always think about with data. I mean, the things you can do is obviously consider the source of the data that you're using. If you're getting it from some agency or some other organization, you want to really vet that data and know exactly what is in it, and as important, what is not in it, because those kinds of factors, the originating data always can determine the outcome of the analysis. So, you know, we just try to make sure that we get data from what we consider reliable sources. If we get it from a government agency, we might find flaws in it, but we explain those right up front to people. We say, this came from this government agency. This is what it includes. We found these flaws. We called them and tried to address them. We found serious problems with state data. For example, we did some stories on test scores for students that were up on the state's website. And we discovered some flaws in the way they were reporting the test score data. And we called them and hounded them. And finally, they actually admitted that they had uploaded the data incorrectly. So we did a story telling people that if you're relying on the data from the state as to how well your students in a particular school are doing, please beware, because the state uploaded the data incorrectly. So we have a responsibility to shout out for those kinds of issues as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would like to point out too, for those in the audience, that data reporting is its own beast. Like, I am a trained journalist, but like I could not do the work that Lorie and her team does. You know, this is
we have a full-time data journalist, and her expertise is data. I mean, she's a great storyteller and a great reporter, but her expertise is data, and she trains other members of our team on data. So Sally, I had this on my list, and I think this was maybe the second slide that you showed. You talked about machine readable signals, and I was wondering if you could share with the group what exactly you mean by that and how regular people can take advantage of these signals to help them find credible news.
Yeah, well, so when we talk about machine readable signals, that is basically providing information. What we do, but like at practical levels, we're providing information on each story, or not we, each news company that's participating provides information in the code that actually creates the page. So the code that allows the text to appear on the page. also includes code that shows what the design should be and everything else. So there's code that's placed there that tells external organizations, well, this is a news story, this is the name of the journalist, and then with the trust indicators, they have an ethics policy on this page. And the way that these are used is that we, from our very start, because as I mentioned, technology platforms have become the primary distributor of news. They like distribute, probably more than 60% of people get their news through platforms like Google and Facebook, Twitter, and now other places like WhatsApp and TikTok. So though they're playing such a critical role in emphasizing certain kinds of news and de-emphasizing others. So part of our goal was to adjust that environment, because they were making assumptions about what is quality journalism and what isn't without really understanding, we thought, what the answer, what is quality journalism. So that's what these signals aim to do. And when people talk about the algorithms, that's the tool that they're using, and basically a mathematical equation that's looking for these bits of code in order to determine what gets surfaced to whom. As far as how users can use those, how the public can use those, I'm not sure I know the answer, other than be very wary of the way in which news is being personalized for you. So the more you click on certain things, the more you will get things like that, which is very dangerous in my mind, because all of us need to have a diversified set of information that helps us understand the world. And these algorithms work against that. And our machine readable code is trying to kind of even the playing field a little bit. So I would just say, watch when you start to see yourself getting, I clicked on a few things on my Google News feed that seemed to make it look like I was interested in gaming. And then all of a sudden I was getting sports, I was getting gaming, I was getting articles about beautiful women, because they apparently thought that I was a young man, reading the news. So, and all of a sudden I wasn't getting other stuff that was really relevant to me. So that's all I can suggest, is be wary, and maybe do click on things that don't really interest you in order to confound the algorithm a little bit.
Absolutely. That's helpful advice, Sally. So, I'm curious, we didn't really touch on this, but Sally, you have a very decorated past, and I mean present too, as a science and health and medical journalist. And Lorie, inewsource, has incredible reporting on, this accountability when it comes to health and medicine too, I saw on your website. And so I'm curious, both of you, we've gone over the trust indicators. Which indicators seem especially relevant, or what should people be looking for if they're trying to identify high quality health journalism?
You want to start, Lorie?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, as I mentioned earlier, the sourcing. I think you really have to pay attention to what the source of the information that you're reading is. I wanted to show you one of our data. This is a story we did, a COVID-related story on excess deaths. Oops, I got to share my screen. Sorry, I was just going there without doing that. I'm going to share the story. We did a story on what we call excess deaths, and due to the pandemic. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that term, but it's been calculated. Excess deaths have been calculated through many different kinds of disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, other kinds of things. And basically what you do is you take the number of deaths in a given period of time, like certain number of months of the pandemic, and then you take the average, like what would the average death number be in a normal year, and you subtract those two, and the difference is what the excess deaths are. And that's basically deaths that are not maybe directly attributed to the pandemic, like you didn't die of COVID, but because you couldn't get out and exercise, and you're an elderly person, and that, that exercise every day was the thing that kept you going, and you ended up dying. That is an example of a death that could be attributed to the pandemic, even though you didn't die of COVID. So we did an analysis of this, which was ended up being pretty controversial. This is the methodology I talked to you about. We got the data and then we crunched it. And when we presented the San Diego County with the results of our data analysis, we also believe in no surprises. That's something like if you have a source that you're trying to ask questions of and they won't be available to talk to you, we give them all the questions that we want to ask them so that when the story comes out, they're not surprised. Oh, that's what they wanted. You know, there should never be a surprise to a source. They should know absolutely what the story is about. So the county really pushed back on our data analysis on this story and said that we shouldn't be calculating excess deaths, that this was something that was not reserved for a pandemic. I mean, it was really strong pushback, but we talked to something like 8 epidemiologists and other data experts, and they absolutely supported the data that we had, how we had done the data analysis, and also the fact that this was an important story to tell. So people could really understand the effects and the extent of the pandemic. So I think really sourcing is huge. Fact checking is also huge. And I think if our Transparify tool had been working when we did this story would be one that was Transparify.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I mean, I covered science and health for a long time, and what the things that that bothered me most was when oftentimes general assignment journalists, although they're required, they do everything, have to do one of these stories, and they're not as careful, they're not as skeptical, or even knowledgeable enough to ask the right questions. So I think it's important to look at the byline and it's not that they can't do it or don't do it well, it's just look at the byline and then you consider like how much of a grain of salt should you apply to it. And then also look for conflict of interest on the part of the sources. So we see a lot of health and science news that's actually put out there to promote a certain product, a certain approach to medicine or health. And so it's just important to make sure that one, the sources being used do not, I mean, I tell journalists this because I do teach around that a little bit, for them to watch their sources, and the public can do that too. And then, as Lorie said, not only look at the sources, but look at how diverse they are. So have they presented the counterpoint of view, or does it read almost like a press release? Like, this is a great new thing, everybody should do it. Do they have the other point of view which says, well, maybe the cautionary note? I would always look for that.
Well, thank you both so much. That was very fascinating and, you know, things I certainly hadn't thought of myself. So I appreciate your insight. I wanted to ask very quickly before I wrap this up, Lorie, we had a question from Laura who asked if you have a print publication or if you're just online.
I'm sorry, but we don't have a print publication. We're online natives, as they call us. If we had a print publication, we'd need a much bigger budget
right.
to do the printing and the delivering, and that's sadly what's happening to traditional media is they just can't afford the cost of printing anymore. But I wish we did. I have ink in my blood. I've been a newspaper reporter my whole life, so I'm sorry to see the print product declining.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both so much, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. I did want to remind you that this will be recorded, so I'll be sure to share it with our other Mediactive participants, and Sally and Lorie, we greatly appreciate your time. So I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks so much for answering all of our questions.
Well,
thank you. And I would be negligent if I didn't conclude by saying, if you'd like to get our newsletter, which gives you news of our latest stories, comes out once or twice a week, so we don't bombard you, just go to inewsource.org and you can sign up to get our latest stories, many of which are relevant to people who don't just live in San Diego, but live in other parts of the country.
And you can learn about the trust indicators at thetrustproject.org, and also some questions related to that and little videos that you can use. And thank you for the opportunity. Thanks everybody for the questions.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good day, everyone.
All right.
Bye. Thank you.